liters. The target was supposed to be 7 million liters, and you've even admitted it. It's only been 2.6 million. You haven't even met your target. And then part of the cost and part of the $66 million is being spent on wood stoves. I have a report from the UK that says wood stoves are 550 times more inefficient than even oil-fired furnaces in the north. This is supposed to be reducing carbon, not making it worse.
The 7.6 target is cumulative. We have met the target in the year that we were requested. The 2.6
buying wood stoves.
Yeah, we'll let
Indigenous
the,
people get to
respond.
choose and have a self-determination based approach in terms of how they would like to replace diesel. This is replacing diesel, which is a huge consumer for carbon.
Diesel fired furnaces emit 5.4 grams per megawatt hour of energy produced.
Okay, Mr. Zimmer.
A solid open fire or wood stove burns 500 times that.
We're out of time now. So we're going to go to the next. And on the second question for 6 minutes, I have Mr. Mr. McLeod, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I didn't hear you say my name. Thank you to Minister Vandal for joining us. I know, Minister Vandal, you're quite aware of our situation in the Northwest Territories. Our communities are on the front line of climate change, and all the changes that are happening are really severely impacting our supply chains. We're seeing barges being redirected to record low levels in the Northwest Territories. Our supplies are having to be trucked all the way to Inuvik and then barged upstream because the Mackenzie River is drying up. You know, there's sandbars all over the place. Even small boats with outboard motors are not able to get around. So all this is disrupting the resupply of essential products. And I wanted to know if you're having these discussions, is this something you're talking about with territorial government people and Indigenous governments, and talking about how the communities in the Northwest Territories will have access to the goods that they require. You know, not every community has a long runway. Many communities don't have roads, and shockingly, the Mackenzie River, which is the longest river in the country, in Canada, and actually the second longest in North America, is all completely, at least in front of my community, it's gravel bars all over the place. There's no way barges are going to get by. We need to find a better way to do things. So I wanted to know what kind of discussions you're having with your colleagues to look at the options and possibilities of how we can lower the cost, because having to redirect our supplies is really going to be draining on our communities. I don't know how some of them are going to continue to exist.
That's a great question, MP McLeod. I know that in the Northwest Territories, I've been to Tuktoyaktuk, and I've seen the shoreline erosion firsthand, where homes had to be moved away from the water, the ocean that is rising, to be replaced. Families had to be relocated to other parts of the town. We know, I've experienced firsthand the Mackenzie River, which is suffering through drought-like conditions, while at the same time there's no less water in the Mackenzie. Northwest Territories last year was burning through an incredible amount of wildfires. 70% of the people that lived in Northwest Territories had to be relocated, and I think it's important that we continue with our whole suite of programs that battle climate change, not only at Northern Affairs, but in other government departments. That's so very important. You need to have a plan first of all, to battle climate change. And if you compare that to, I think it was not even 2 years ago, where the Conservative Party had an annual general meeting where the membership of the party actually voted to deny that climate change, voted to say that climate change was not real. It was a hoax. So you can see that sort of philosophy is dripping down to the party, the people sitting in this room who actually don't believe that climate change is real. And that's simply the reality. But I've had good conversations with Premier R.J. Simpson. As little time as 2 weeks ago, we were in Iqaluit together, where we talked about all of the challenges and all of the ways that our governments can work together. We've got a good relationship with the territorial government. We know that this is an existential threat, but it has to start. It has to begin. Through the dark decade that we suffered through prior to our government being elected in 2015, there was absolutely nothing done for climate change, for infrastructure, and we need to reverse that. And we know it's the right thing to do, and we know that's what Canadians want.
Mr. McLeod, you have 1 minute left if you have another question. And you're muted.
You're muted.
I wanted to quickly check with you because I think it's very important. I already asked Patty Hajdu, Minister Hajdu, about this. Have you been having any discussions with your colleagues regarding bringing forward a program for public and private home insurance? Because most people in our communities now can't afford the new rates, and people are just going without insurance, and so if they lose their house, they become essentially homeless.
Was identified to myself by yourself actually some time ago. There have been discussions there have been discussions with the Premier as well, and those are important discussions that are ongoing, and for sure we are going to follow up on that to do whatever we need to do.
Okay, we're out of time, and we're now going to go to Monsieur Lemire, who will have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Vandal, housing crisis in First Nations is partly caused by lack of access to capital, and this stems from limitations of the Indian Act on land, and there's also the concentration of resources and responsibilities connected to housing with the government, which leaves little option for individual initiatives. These factors feed into each other, turning it into a vicious cycle. During the meeting on March 20th, the committee meeting here, I was able to bring up the idea of loans to individuals as a tool to reduce the expenditure and reliance on federal funding. And this would be a way of reducing the gap in terms of housing. And the government initially responded favorably, came up with the certain initiatives. One is a network of funding for housing by and for Indigenous communities. So in this context of budget, how much funding would be available to such an initiative to be able to offer alternative solutions which might in part solve the crisis of housing for Indigenous communities?
We assist in...
That's a very good question. In all of my initiatives in the North, the topic that people want to talk to me about the most is affordable and sustainable housing. And I know that in this budget there is $900 million set aside for housing for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. And also in the previous budget, 2023, we had at least $4 billion for urban rural housing in the north. But I think we need to continue to work on new models. It is clear that there's such a great need that we'll never be able to cover all of the needs within the span of a couple of years. So we need to study different models, such as the ones you highlighted. And we need, of course, the ministries that are in charge of the housing file around the table to discuss this. I'd be interested to have a more in-depth discussion based on this idea so that we can set up a working group. That would be great, actually, because if we develop the capacities of these Indigenous financial institutions, they can go to places where traditional institutions cannot take the risk because they consider these markets to be high-risk markets. So this one particular initiative is an institution that has proven itself. So when can we expect real change in such a project? And there's already a solution. There's a pilot project that's yielded impressive results, so that can have a chance to stand on its feet. So I take your answer as extending a hand, and it answers in part the other question I was going to ask. But that is something of interest for me. I'd like to also talk about the First Nations Financial Authority. We have Ontario and Alberta that underline the robustness of their controls in place on this topic. But can we seize the moment to expand their mandates to the benefit of Indigenous communities so that they can act more for Indigenous communities if we want to develop this aspect of the infrastructure a bit more? Yes, absolutely. We all want to move towards self-determination, and that is what we're planning for. If there are models in Quebec or elsewhere in Canada based on which we can create partnerships to build houses, we're definitely interested. This is clearly in the mandate of the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, Gary Anandasangari. So that might be a good question to ask him next week. But it doesn't mean that we cannot start the planning phase and get together with stakeholders to talk about the potential of such a project. But it is more important than ever to attract private investment as well to do this. Well, judging by the rhythm of things, the Crown has the option of transferring funding to First Nations that could be used to fund loans and use this on the financial markets. And we're looking at $200 million per year potentially in such an initiative. So are there elements or components of such an initiative that could be set up and initiated this immediately?
Response, and I'll move to the next question.
Potentially, but that would require a longer discussion. Maybe we need to get together and bring other departments as well together. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Ms. Idlout. And whenever you're ready, Ms. Idlout, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. You mentioned that climate change is a threat and happening very fast. And reducing carbon diesel, reducing diesel and carbon is also a problem. In Kivalliq region, Kuwaitan region, they had a plan to reduce emissions. But what happens is you fund those annually, so it's not a long-term plan with annual funding. If the Kivalliq hyperlink is going to happen, I wish to ask you, when will there be enough money, adequate money for Kivalliq hydro project so they can proceed with the work they want to do and to reduce diesel and carbon emissions? We need to be more mindful of our climate. When are you going to give them enough funding to address some of the carbon and diesel issues?
It's a very important region in Canada. It's immediately north of Manitoba. It's about 300 kilometers from Churchill. And we have worked well with Kivalliq, the Kivalliq Hydro Fiber Project. I think through some of our programs, we funded upwards of $15 million to date to get some of the preliminary work done. And it's a very important project. A couple of things that are important is that we've had a change of government in Manitoba, and the new government is much more interested in being a partner with Kivalliq than the previous one was, which is really no surprise to me. But they're interested in being at the table. They're interested in being a source of hydroelectricity for Kivalliq, but it's very preliminary, and those discussions are ongoing. The second thing is that I've been talking to the Premier of Nunavut, who sees the benefit of that hydro fiber link. There's also another project. There's a couple of more projects in Nunavut that are equally important. These are long-term projects which are going to bring incredible benefit once they're done. And in Budget 24, there's ongoing discussions about investment tax credits, which in an ideal world, which we hope that Kivalliq will be able to benefit from. So it's an important file. It's a long-term file and long-term investment, but that's what we were elected. We were elected to think long-term here to solve some of the large problems that Canada faces and the world.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier regarding infrastructure money, which will be $918 million towards housing. We know that it's not enough for housing. We know in Inuit lands, they need $75.1 billion to adequately house the population. The funding before the 2024 budget was released, the premiers, Yukon and the BUT and Nunavut, the three premiers wrote a letter ahead of time that they required $600 million, and they gave you adequate notice before the budget. While you were doing the budget preparation, you said the premiers that you are working with them very well. But why is it when they requested $600 million, you did not allow that in their budget?
Housing is a priority in the north, affordable, safe housing. I can say that we are working well with the premiers. They've made requests. They haven't always received everything that they've requested. But I will say this, that in the last 8 years, our government has spent more than any other government in the history of Canada on housing in the north. And there's still a lot of work to do. The problem being, of course, the gaps are so large from previous governments not investing what they should have in the north for housing and infrastructure. And I say previous governments of all stripes. I'm not trying to be partisan here. I think it'll take us a long time to catch up, but we're committed to doing it.
Thank you for your reply. I will remind you to remember your response. So in the future, when you reply this way, that you've already spent a lot of money and you've spent major money, remember that. Many have no homes. Many are homeless. Many have no safe homes. Children go to school after sleeping in overcrowded houses which are moldy and old. What you respond to is by saying that you give a lot of money. It hasn't made any changes to our problems, social problems, housing problems. Don't respond to me how much money you've spent. Remember how much money you said you have spent. Is it enough? Is it addressing the needs?
For that.
Yes, I agree that we need to do a lot more in the North, in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and Yukon. I'm not disagreeing with the member. I'm saying that we've made progress, and there's a lot of work to do, and we will continue to work on investments in the North and the Arctic. As we will continue to work in partnership.
Okay, thank you. Colleagues, I understand, Minister, that you have also a time restriction of 6:30. And so I do need a bit of direction before the Minister goes, just to see, because these are mains and we're able to report them back to the House by May 31st, I'm looking for some direction. Normally, at the end of the hearing, we would do the call on shall various votes carry. We have received confirmation that Minister Anand Sangari will come to meet us on May 29th, which will be prior to the reporting back period. And so we can wait to do the voting on the votes until after we hear from the Minister. Minister Haidu, her team has come back. She's scheduled to come on June 3rd to discuss housing in response to the Auditor General's report, and she'll be here with Minister Fraser on housing. So her team has said that she could stay for the extra half hour to finish off today's discussion on mains. The issue is that June 3rd is after the reporting back period. And so do we want to hold the reporting back to the House, the votes, until we hear from Minister Anand Sangari, but not Minister Haidu? Because if we wait for her, then we don't report them back. They just go back as studied, but nothing. So looking for direction from the committee on that. And then the other piece that I was asking at the beginning, for the 29th, do we want to have Minister Anand Sangari on top of the two panels for the taxation study for a third hour that day, or do you want me to bump the second panel or the first panel, whichever one it is, when he can come and stay with the resources we have for the 2 hours on May 29th? So if we could get input from the committee on those, and Minister, I know that you don't need to be here for this. I was told you need to leave at 6:30. And I don't know if we want to go with the round of questions after the Minister's gone with officials, if they're able to stay. I turn to the committee for your direction. Ms. Idlout. On his way, Minister Vandell, thank you for being here. And Ms. Idlout, your
Thank you. I'm very unhappy. I'm not pleased. If I had been told that Vandal was going to leave early, I would have asked my partner beside me from NDP to ask his question, because I'm upset because the Liberal ministers say that Indigenous people are very important and that the North is very important and Northerners are very important. But as much as they say how important we are, they do not make time for us. They leave early. We are trying to resolve some of our issues. They do not reply to our questions. They are discounting us and our issues by leaving early. We are not a priority to them. Thank you.
For an hour. Votes have disrupted things today. That's the reality of it. And we were 15 minutes late starting with this panel. He has I was told he has a stop at 6:30, so that I don't control his calendar. He needs to go. But we have the officials who have said that they're able to stay. Sorry, Mr. Desjardins.
No, listen, this kind of relationship between our democratic institutions and the ministers that they're supposed to hold accountable is exactly why Canadians, and most particularly Indigenous people, can't trust these institutions. When we have credible questions about the main estimates, which are the financial resources for the capital projects of Indigenous communities, and when we have members of Parliament who are present in this committee, who are representing Indigenous nations, who represent constituents who are concerned about the outcomes of Indigenous people in this country, they find themselves at a loss when we have a minister, not just Minister Vandal, but what I understand is Miss Patty Hajou has declined to stay for the entire hour. I'm not a regular member of this committee, but when in my committee, the Public Accounts Committee, to which, Clerk, I recognize that you're here, my former clerk, we would force the government members to stay. This is, and when it comes to issues, most particularly to the vital outcomes of Indigenous people, this is simply unacceptable, Chair. Should you wish to represent this institution as you are as this chair of this committee, it is your obligation to ensure that we have a credible amount of time and effort put into the questions that members who are democratically elected to this place have an opportunity to actually ask. Without that, Chair, we have a difference in our ability to actually either hold accountable the government or to the government members to speak to the benefits of Indigenous communities. And so it defeats the mandate of this committee to do either if the minister is not present. I find this to be incredibly challenging, yeah. Mr. Chair.
If I could, and I know you're a guest here, I don't know if you saw the notice of meeting, but what was published for today was the first hour, 4:30 to 5:30, with Minister Hajdu. So that's what we had booked. She had committed to an hour with us. As we know, there were bells that prevented us from starting at 4:30. And so that created a crunch right from the start when we were able to start. And we actually started 10 minutes earlier than we should have through unanimous consent of the committee. So the votes caused this crunch. The second hour, Minister Vandal had agreed to be here from 5:30 to 6:30 for the full hour. But because of votes, and he had planned his day, I don't control his calendar, we were told we had him till 6:30, and then he had other commitments he had made. And so it's through this unfortunate circumstances of votes disrupting our meeting. Usually on Wednesdays, there's ones after question period. Then we're able to start at 4:30 and go through our 2 hours. Today is one of those unusual days. And so we've done the best that we can. The ministers have committed to being here for the time that they could with a hard stop. So that's I believe I did my job by setting up the meeting with the resources we had for the times we had, and in response to the motion, which was to have all three ministers here for the 2 hours. We've now already agreed to have a third minister, Minister Annan Sangri, come for a third hour. And Minister Hajdu, because she had to leave early, has agreed to come back for the remainder of her time that we were unable to spend with her. It's just that she can't get here back to us before May 31st. And so we'll still hear from her. We'll still have a chance to interact with her. But if there's going to be a vote on the mains, less the amounts that were passed through the interim supply period, that has to be done by May 31st. So that's where we're at. We do have the witnesses here who have said we have resources till 6:45 with this panel. And so if we want to go in, the next round would be 15 minutes, 5 for the Conservatives, 5 for the Liberals, 2.5 for the Bloc, and 2.5 for the NDP. We will run out of time at 6:45, so I leave it. I also had asked for some direction on 2 items. One is the May 29th. Do we want to have a third hour with the minister or displace the one of the 2 panels that we have already booked for the taxation study? And on do we want to do the reporting back, the voting on mains at the end of that meeting, as opposed to waiting for Minister Haidu's final appearance? So yeah, I have a speaking order here, but that's kind of where we're at with this. So Mr. Malillo, we'll go to you first. And who's that? No, Mr. Malillo was first. I actually gone to Mr. Desjardins before. So it's Mr. Malillo and then Mr. Desjardins. So that's the order we'll go. So
okay.
Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. You asked us a few questions, so I'll try to address them all. And just to start off, I don't want to belabor the point. We've heard from some other members, but I do also agree that it's unacceptable that we weren't able to have either minister for the full hour. I understand the explanation you gave. Just want to make that very clear as well. It's very much standard practice that the ministers do everything they can to honor the time, regardless of votes and how things may change. So this is quite unusual and certainly quite concerning. To that end, I do think we should, as we have invited Minister Haidu back, we should offer the same to Minister Vandal. If that can't be done before the date to report back, I don't think that's necessarily an issue. I do think it's important that we hear from them, even if we have reported back. I would say for next week's meeting, we have lots of important stuff to get to. I would suggest, if it's possible and we have the resources for a 3-hour meeting, would be favorable for us so that we can fit that all in. And lastly, I know that other members have their hands up. I think we're probably going to have a few other things to discuss based on the questions you put before, so I'd suggest we let the witnesses go.
Is there agreement from the committee to allow the officials to go? And then we'll look at, to the point, we'll invite Minister Vandal back for, there would be 15 minutes on the clock for him. I'm seeing some heads and nod. So we'll thank our witnesses for being here. You're released for the day. And we'll also go back to Minister Vandal's office and see if he's available to come back to finish out the time that we had asked him to be here. Mr. Desjardins, I did have you next to my speaking list.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'll have to beg your pardon because I think we both know, you as the chair of this committee, you have the power to second resources for the purpose of executing the mandate of Parliament, the mandate of this committee, which is to ensure that ministers, in this case on the main estimates, are made present. Other committees, when they're suspended for a vote, will allocate the difference of time to the end of the day in order for the meeting to take place, in order for parliamentarians to have the right to exercise their voice towards a question that the government needs to answer. What I have a preference for is for cooperation of a chair that would make those rights possible. I'm not saying I find you contemptuous of your mandate. I find it disingenuous, however, to suggest that the minister's calendar is paramount to Parliament. And so I'd suggest and deeply beg you, Chair, to take this into consideration in the future. Like, come on. It's your job to make sure that members of Parliament, especially when it comes to Indigenous issues, that these questions are asked and that you take this seriously. What I've heard around this table today is almost nothing other than the Conservatives talking about why the North doesn't get stoves or shouldn't get stoves to heat their homes, and then the very good questions from Ms. Edlout. Second to that point, we then end the meeting short for credible questions on the resourcing of Indigenous issues. Come on. Like, we got to get real here. Like, this is not how members of Parliament who are elected should be treated. The minister can't just come out here and say, oh, my calendar, I got dinner at 6:30. Sorry, John, I got to go. No. This committee is a committee made for the purpose of Indigenous peoples and their policies. And until our chair can make certain that we're respected, the policies that, or lack thereof, even accountability, which is an important mechanism of this place, isn't met. Wouldn't you agree?
If I could respond, I would offer that there is no chair that controls ministers' calendars. And as I said, I was tasked through a motion.
It's not about the calendars. No,
I know we
Chair,
were asked.
it's not about the calendars.
I have my mic's on now, so I'm going to speak in response to the concerns you've raised. And that is that we extended the invitations for the ministers. The ministers were very flexible today in adapting. The motion had been 3 ministers in 2 hours. We now have 3 ministers for 3 hours. Votes have disrupted that. The ministers and Sangari and Haidu have agreed to come back to give us their full hour that they had committed to. And we will extend the offer to Minister Vandal to see if he's able to come back for the balance of the time. Because I agree that this is a very important function of our committees to look at where money is being spent through the budgetary allocations. And we've had disruptions today. I can't compel the ministers to stay beyond the time that they have planned out their day. They know that we're here.
But the committee could.
And we had officials, and they were willing to stay to continue the discussions, but there was agreement from the committee to release them, so that's what we've done.
I feel like it's now a matter of a motion that's required to compel you, Chair, to make certain that the commitments of time made by the ministers are actually met. And I believe this is something that the opposition should unite on, Conservatives, Bloc, New Democrats. We should formulate a motion at this next meeting to actually ensure that Indigenous people are given a fair shake here, because this is unacceptable. That's my last comment, and I'm saddened that this is how accountability for Indigenous people is met in committee. It's not fair.
Okay, next to my speaking list, I have Mr. Batiste and then Mr. Carr. Okay, Mr. Carr.
Mr. Chair, respectfully to my colleague, for whom I have, well, it's got to go through the chair, as you know. That.
What are you going to say more than?
Well, you've taken an opportunity, Mr. Desjardins, to make a bit of a grandstanding here about what you perceive.
Talking about Indigenous accountability is grandstanding. Is that what you're saying?
Can I finish?
What that you just said.
May I finish?
You may finish, but I'm questioning your objectives here.
May I finish?
Mr. Carr, you have the floor. We'll get you to make your statement.
I believe it's been made fairly clear, Mr. Chair and colleagues, that despite the concern that some members of this committee have raised today, fairly enough, about the way in which today's meeting was undertaken, the important thing is that the adherence to the principles that my colleague across the way have raised, which is that of accountability and that of ministerial accountability specifically, will be met and will be undertaken. It just means we have to wait a couple of more days or weeks in order for that to happen. If there is something pressing in the next week or so that, if not answered, my colleagues believe will jeopardize the outcome of a particular community, then I think it's fair for that to be raised and for that to be brought to the attention of the ministers immediately. Having said that, given that the nature of today's visit was specifically in relation to the main estimates, I think it is reasonable that in light of the disruptions that occurred today, that Ministers Haidu, Ananda Sangre, and upon the asking of the committee, as per Mr. Malillo's remarks a few moments ago, will return in order to meet the accountability measures that the committee expects of them. So I think a deep breath here. I think it's a little bit far-fetched to suggest, when there has been a public commitment already on the part of the ministers to return and a public commitment on the part of all members of the committee to re-invite Minister Vandal, that we suggest that there is some type of evasion of parliamentary accountability here. I also do just simply want to say to my colleague, and perhaps he hasn't spent a lot of time around this table in the last couple of months, we try very hard to be collegial at this committee. And we try to work
Mr.
with
Carr,
one another.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt, but if I could get you to wrap up. The bells there are bells going.
Okay,
and so
sure.
we
So,
need to wind
so I
up.
think there can be disagreement, Mr. Chair, of course, about the quality of answers, the satisfaction of answers, but I do think a commitment to trying to be collegial. Mr. Zimmer may not feel that there's collegiality between either myself and him or other members of the government side, but certainly with other members, I do think that exists, and I just hope that we can make an effort to try to have that tone of collegiality continue. So I respect the concerns of my colleague across the way, but I don't see any reason to believe that there's an evasion of accountability. It just means, unfortunately, due to what happened today, we have to wait a couple of weeks before we see the ministers again.
Okay, Mr. Batiste, really, because we do need to go now that the bells have gone.
Well, Mr. Chair, I know that we're not going to wrap up all of the questions you had for us today, but what I wanted to make sure that your last few minutes as chair of this committee weren't spent in a bad way. And as a First Nations person and as a colleague, I want to end this meeting by thanking you for your contributions as chair. This is a difficult job. It's difficult to chair. There's a lot of emotions that a lot of people are really trying to do our best to move forward on Indigenous issues, and we all know where we need to get to for reconciliation, but sometimes we disagree on the first steps. But I just want to thank you for your time. Thank you for all that you've done and for your role in advancing reconciliation over the past few months as not only a member of this committee, but I was the chair. And as the final thing, farewell. Have a great trip, and we'll see you in the future.
Great, thank you. And with that, I'm sure most people have caught it by now, but this is my last meeting as the chair, so thank you. It's been a pleasure working with everybody. I'm resigning